London, 10 Downing Street, late evening, August 1943. The war maps covered the table like a second battlefield. Red pins marked Allied positions across the Mediterranean. Blue pins marked German divisions digging themselves into the Balkans. The lamps burned low. Cigarette smoke hung in the room like fog over a battlefield that had not yet been fought. At the center of the room stood Winston Churchill. His finger moved across the map of Europe with theatrical certainty. The Balkans, Yugoslavia, Greece, the soft underbelly of Hitler's empire, as he had called it for months. Churchill believed history was offering him an opportunity. If Allied armies struck north from the Mediterranean, they could shatter German control of southeastern Europe, block Soviet expansion, and reshape the post-war balance of power before Moscow reached the heart of the continent. It was not merely a strategy, it was a legacy. Across the table stood the man responsible for deciding whether such dreams could survive contact with reality. Alanbrooke, the British Army's chief professional soldier. Where Churchill saw arrows sweeping dramatically across maps, Brooke saw tonnage, ships, landing craft, divisions that did not exist. For months, he had listened as Churchill returned again and again to the same idea: a massive Allied thrust through the Balkans, a political stroke disguised as a military one. But now the moment had come when the arithmetic of war could no longer be avoided. Brooke leaned over the table. His voice was calm, controlled, almost clinical. Prime Minister, the army required for such an operation does not exist. The room fell silent. Churchill did not look up immediately. His finger remained on the map of Yugoslavia. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the slow irritation of a man who believed imagination was being strangled by accountants. "You are thinking only of obstacles, Brooke." But the chief of the Imperial General Staff was thinking of something far more dangerous than obstacles. He was thinking about a catastrophe. Because behind Churchill's sweeping plan lay a brutal fact that no rhetoric could erase. The Allied armies were already committed elsewhere, and if Britain gambled wrong now, the war itself could change direction. The argument that unfolded in that dimly lit room had been building for years. For Winston Churchill, the Mediterranean was not simply a theater of war, it was the center of his strategic imagination. Since 1940, he had believed that the downfall of Adolf Hitler might come not from a brutal frontal assault across northern France, but from a chain of blows delivered along Europe's southern edge. North Africa, Italy, then the Balkans. To Churchill, this path offered elegance. It avoided the nightmare of a direct invasion of France while exploiting Germany's weaker allies. If Allied armies moved through Greece and Yugoslavia, the German southern flank could collapse like a rotten beam. But there was another calculation beneath Churchill's vision, and it had nothing to do with Germany. By the summer of 1943, the armies of Joseph Stalin were pushing westward with terrifying momentum. The Red Army had already begun reclaiming vast territories lost during the German invasion of 1941. Churchill understood the implications immediately. Every mile the Soviet army advanced was a mile of Europe that might fall under Soviet influence when the war ended. The Balkans mattered not just because they could hurt Germany, they mattered because they might determine who controlled southeastern Europe after the war. And Churchill had no intention of allowing Moscow to decide that future alone. But while Churchill thought in terms of empires and post-war balance, the men responsible for fighting the war were drowning in logistical realities. The British Empire was exhausted. By 1943, Britain had already mobilized nearly 5 million men. Its merchant fleet had suffered devastating losses in the Atlantic. Shipping remained the single most precious resource in the Allied war machine. Every invasion required thousands of landing craft. Every division required millions of tons of supplies. And there was one operation that had already claimed nearly all of those resources: the long-promised invasion of northern France. The Americans had been demanding it relentlessly. Franklin D. Roosevelt and his generals believed the war could only be won by smashing directly into Hitler's fortress in Western Europe. No diversions, no Mediterranean adventures. One decisive blow across the English Channel. The plan already had a name: Operation Overlord. And standing between Churchill's Balkan dream and that operation was the man who had spent the entire war quietly blocking the Prime Minister's more dangerous impulses: Alanbrooke. Brooke had kept a private diary throughout the war. In it, he described his daily struggle to restrain Churchill's strategic imagination. The Prime Minister, he once wrote with barely concealed frustration, has an extraordinary ability to produce schemes which are magnificent in conception but impossible in execution. To Brooke, the Balkan proposal was the most dangerous scheme yet, because he understood something Churchill refused to accept. The geography of the Balkans was a defender's paradise: mountains, narrow roads, hostile terrain. Any invasion there would require enormous forces just to move forward a few miles, and the Allies simply did not possess those forces. Still, Churchill refused to abandon the idea. Again and again, he returned to the map. Again and again, Brooke dismantled the proposal with numbers: tonnage, divisions, landing craft. Each calculation pointed to the same brutal conclusion: to invade the Balkans would mean weakening the coming assault on France. And if that invasion failed, the war might drag on for years. Yet Churchill continued pressing, which meant that sooner or later, the quiet chief of the Imperial General Staff would have to do something few men in Britain dared attempt. He would have to tell the Prime Minister of the British Empire that his grand strategy was impossible. The confrontation that finally forced the issue did not unfold in public. It happened in the quiet rooms of Britain's wartime command meetings, where maps were studied not as symbols of ambition, but as instruments of calculation. At the center of those calculations stood Alanbrooke. Brooke had spent the war mastering a difficult role: managing the strategic imagination of Winston Churchill without humiliating him. It was a delicate balance. Churchill was not merely the Prime Minister. He was the living symbol of Britain's defiance during its darkest hour. His authority was political, emotional, and almost mythic. But the war itself obeyed no myths. It obeyed logistics. By late 1943, the Allied command structure had become brutally clear about the scale of the coming invasion of Western Europe. To cross the English Channel would require the largest amphibious operation in human history. Not hundreds of ships, thousands. Landing craft alone numbered in the thousands: LSTs, LCIs, LCTs, each one built slowly in shipyards already operating at maximum capacity. Every craft assigned to the Mediterranean meant one fewer available for the assault on France. Brooke laid out the numbers methodically. A Balkan invasion would require at least 20 divisions simply to secure beachheads and supply lines through the mountainous terrain of Yugoslavia and Greece. 20 divisions. The Allies did not possess them. Most American and British forces were already earmarked for the coming assault across the Channel. Others were tied down in Italy, where German forces had transformed the peninsula into a brutal defensive fortress. Every new operation demanded more shipping, more fuel, more aircraft, more men. And those resources were not theoretical. They existed in precise quantities. Brooke knew exactly how many landing craft Britain and the United States would possess by the spring of 1944, and every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. If the Balkan invasion proceeded, Operation Overlord would be delayed, perhaps by a year. That delay terrified the American High Command. Generals in Washington feared that postponement would give Adolf Hitler precious time to strengthen the Atlantic Wall along the French coast: concrete bunkers, minefields, gun batteries. Every month of delay would turn the beaches of Normandy into something closer to a fortress. The Americans were already suspicious of Churchill's Mediterranean strategy. Some believed Britain was deliberately avoiding the direct assault on France in order to preserve its own imperial interests. Brooke understood that perception. He also understood something else. If Britain appeared to sabotage the invasion of France, the fragile alliance with the United States could fracture at the very moment victory was approaching, which meant the Balkan plan carried a risk far greater than military failure. It threatened the unity of the entire Allied coalition. And so Brooke delivered his final assessment. The proposal was examined, the supply tables were calculated, the naval allocations were reviewed. Then he spoke with the cold precision of a professional soldier who understood that arithmetic had already decided the matter. There are not sufficient landing craft. The phrase sounded almost trivial, but within it lay the destruction of Churchill's grand design. No landing craft, no invasion, no Balkan campaign. Just the grim reality that modern war was governed not by bold arrows on maps, but by the slow mathematics of steel, fuel, and transport. Still, the Prime Minister was not a man who abandoned his ideas easily, and when Brooke finished speaking, Churchill's reaction revealed exactly how personal the argument had become. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. The calculations had been presented. The numbers were final. The conclusion was unavoidable. Yet the man sitting at the head of the table had built an entire strategic vision around rejecting the obvious. Winston Churchill leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the map spread across the table. The Balkans, Yugoslavia, Greece, the Danube corridor into the heart of Europe. For months, he had imagined Allied armies advancing through those valleys, liberating southeastern Europe before the Soviet armies arrived. In Churchill's mind, such a move would not only cripple Germany, it would shape the political map of post-war Europe. It was a vision of balance, of British influence, of a continent not dominated by Moscow. But now the vision had collided with something Churchill hated more than enemy resistance: arithmetic. Across the table stood Alanbrooke. Brooke had not raised his voice. He had not challenged Churchill's authority directly. Instead, he had done something far more devastating. He had removed the illusion that choice still existed. No landing craft, no divisions, no shipping. Every available resource was already tied to the coming invasion of France, the operation that the Americans insisted must happen. Operation Overlord. Churchill understood exactly what that meant. If Britain insisted on the Balkan plan, the consequences would extend far beyond military logistics. It would fracture the alliance with the United States. And without American power, the war could not be won. The Prime Minister rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the map. Those who witnessed moments like this during the war knew the signs. Churchill often paced when he was furious. He would circle the room, speaking rapidly, building arguments as he moved. But this time, he did not speak immediately. His hand rested on the Balkans. The gesture carried an unmistakable weight. Not simply a strategic position, but a lost possibility. Finally, he turned back toward Brooke. For months, the Prime Minister had accused his generals of excessive caution. He had argued that military planners lacked imagination. Now his tone was quieter, almost reflective. "You are telling me," Churchill said slowly, "that the war cannot be fought according to vision." Brooke answered with the same calm certainty he had shown throughout the meeting. "The war must be fought according to means." It was a brutal answer, because it stripped strategy down to its simplest truth. Victory did not belong to the side with the grandest plans. It belonged to the side that could move the greatest number of men, machines, and supplies to the right place at the right time. And in that contest, there was only one operation that mattered now: the invasion of France. Churchill stood silent for several seconds. Then he nodded once. It was not dramatic, it was not theatrical, but those in the room understood what had just happened. The Prime Minister of Britain, one of the most forceful political figures of the 20th century, had just surrendered a strategic vision he had defended for years, because the mathematics of modern war made resistance impossible. The meeting ended quietly. No dramatic declarations, no public acknowledgement of what had just occurred. But the consequences of that moment inside Britain's wartime command would ripple across the entire continent. Winston Churchill had yielded, reluctantly, temporarily, but unmistakably. The Balkan invasion, the strategy he believed might shape Europe's political future, was effectively dead. Instead, the full industrial power of the Western Allies would now focus on a single objective: France. Across the English Channel, the machinery of the greatest amphibious invasion in history accelerated. Shipyards worked day and night constructing the landing craft that Alanbrooke had insisted were too scarce to waste on secondary campaigns. Every vessel was counted, every division assigned. By the spring of 1944, more than 156,000 Allied troops would land on the beaches of Normandy during the operation that history would remember as D-Day. The invasion succeeded, but at enormous cost. More than 10,000 Allied casualties occurred on the first day alone. Yet the foothold held. Within weeks, millions of Allied soldiers were pouring into France, forcing the German army into a massive retreat across Western Europe. The strategic decision Brooke had defended now proved decisive. Germany was being crushed from two directions: from the west by the Anglo-American armies, from the east by the unstoppable advance of Joseph Stalin and the Red Army. But Churchill never forgot what had been lost, because the same decision that ensured victory in France also guaranteed something else. The Balkans would not be liberated by Western armies. They would be liberated by the Soviet ones. By late 1944, Soviet forces were sweeping through Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Communist governments soon emerged across Eastern Europe, governments backed by Soviet military power. Churchill watched these developments with growing alarm. The map of Europe he had once studied in that London war room was being redrawn, but not by British or American armies, by Moscow. Years later, Churchill would describe the new geopolitical reality with a phrase that captured the continent's division: the Iron Curtain. From the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic, Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence. Some historians would later argue that Churchill's abandoned Balkan strategy might have slowed that expansion. Perhaps, but the truth was harsher. In 1943, the Western Allies simply lacked the forces to pursue both ambitions at once. They could strike France or gamble on the Balkans. They could not do both. And so, the brutal arithmetic of war had chosen the path. In the end, the argument between Churchill and Brooke revealed something profound about modern warfare. Vision alone was not enough. Even the will of a prime minister could not override the physical limits of ships, men, and machines. The war would be won by logistics, and the map of post-war Europe would bear the marks of that calculation for the next half-century.